Captain Sarah Martinez stood at the weather station display, watching the swirling mass of Hurricane Elena approach the Gulf Coast. The meteorologist's voice crackled over the radio, updating all aircraft personnel about wind speeds that had just jumped to 130 miles per hour. Around her, seasoned pilots shook their heads and walked away from the flight board. The rescue mission everyone had been discussing was now officially impossible. "No way anyone's flying in that," muttered Colonel Richardson, the base commander who had 25 years of experience under his belt. "Those winds would flip an Apache like a toy helicopter." Sarah kept studying the weather data. 3 oil rig workers were stranded on platform Delta 7, 40 miles offshore. The Coast Guard couldn't reach them by boat due to 30-foot waves, and their medical helicopter had been grounded. One worker had suffered a heart attack, and time was running out. Every hour they waited meant less chance of survival for the man whose family was probably pacing hospital floors right now. "Martinez, forget about it," called Major Stevens as he passed by. "I've got 1,500 hours in combat zones, and I wouldn't take that risk. Sometimes you have to accept that Mother Nature wins." But Sarah had grown up in Tornado Alley, where her father worked as an emergency responder. She remembered nights when he would drive into storms that made other people run for shelter. He taught her that calculated risks were different from stupid risks, and that the difference often meant someone lived or died. The Apache helicopter she was certified to fly sat in the hangar, its twin engines capable of generating enough power to lift 11 tons. She had studied every technical manual about the aircraft's performance in extreme weather. The machine could handle winds up to 60 knots in normal operations, but the military had tested it in much worse conditions. The key was understanding how to use the storm's own forces instead of fighting them directly. Sarah pulled out her tablet and began calculating wind vectors, storm movement patterns, and potential flight paths. If she could time the approach correctly, there might be windows where the wind patterns created temporary corridors of slightly calmer air. The hurricanes I was still hours away, but the outer bands moved in predictable cycles. Colonel Richardson noticed her still working at the weather station. "Martinez, I know you want to help, but this isn't about courage. It's about physics. Those winds will tear apart anything we put in the air." "Sir, what if I told you I found a possible approach vector?" Sarah replied, turning her tablet to show him the calculations. "The wind patterns create brief windows every 18 minutes where the gusts drop to manageable levels along this corridor." The colonel studied her work for several minutes. Sarah had graduated top of her class from flight school and had logged 800 hours in Apache helicopters, including some of the most challenging training exercises the military offered. Her precision flying had earned respect from instructors who rarely gave compliments. "Even if your calculations are correct, the margin for error is essentially zero," he said. "One mistake, one unexpected wind shear, and you're gone." The Apache is tough, but it's not magic. Sarah understood the risks better than anyone. But she also understood that 3 people were counting on someone being willing to take those risks. The oil platform's emergency beacon had been transmitting for 6 hours, and each update from the trapped workers sounded more desperate. "I've run simulations on every possible scenario," she explained. "The Apache's fly-by-wire system can compensate for wind variations up to a certain threshold. If I stay below 200 feet and follow the calculated approach, the computer can help manage the stability issues." Other pilots had gathered around to listen to the conversation. Most looked skeptical, but a few nodded as they followed her technical explanations. Lieutenant Commander Walsh, a Navy pilot with carrier experience, studied the weather data over her shoulder. "The approach vector makes sense," he admitted, "but the return trip will be flying directly into strengthening winds." "How do you handle that part?" Sarah had already worked out that problem. "By the time we're ready to return, the eye wall will be closer. If we time it right, we can use the calmer conditions near the eye to make the return trip easier, not harder." The discussion was interrupted by another radio update from the oil platform. The worker's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and the platform's medical supplies were running low. Without immediate evacuation, they might lose him within hours. Colonel Richardson made the decision that would change everything. Martinez, I'm not ordering you to do this, but if you believe you can make it work, and if you're willing to accept full responsibility for the mission, I'll authorize the attempt. The hangar became busy with preparation activity. Ground crews began prepping the Apache, while Sarah ran through pre-flight checks that were more thorough than anything she had done before. Every system needed to be perfect because there would be no room for mechanical failures in hurricane conditions. Chief Warrant Officer Thompson, the most experienced Apache mechanic on base, personally inspected every critical component. I've never prepped a bird for weather like this, he told Sarah. But if anyone can bring her home, it's you. Just remember that the machine can only do what physics allows. As Sarah climbed into the pilot's seat, she felt the weight of everyone's doubts mixing with their hopes. The Apache's engines spooled up with their familiar whine, and she began the startup sequence she had performed hundreds of times. But today felt different. Today, everything had to be absolutely perfect. The tower cleared her for takeoff with words that sounded more like a prayer than standard radio protocol. Apache 77, winds are gusting to 100 miles per hour at altitude. Current conditions are beyond normal operational limits. You are cleared for departure at pilot's discretion. Sarah lifted off into air that immediately tried to throw the helicopter sideways. The Apache's computer systems worked overtime to maintain stability as she fought her way toward the ocean. Behind her, everyone on base watched radar screens and held their breath, knowing they might be witnessing either an impossible rescue or a terrible tragedy. The Apache helicopter bucked and rolled as Sarah fought through the outer edges of Hurricane Elena. Rain hammered the cockpit windows so hard that visibility dropped to almost nothing. She relied on instruments and radar to navigate, trusting technology while her hands worked constantly to keep the aircraft stable. 20 miles from shore, the first real test came. A downdraft caught the helicopter and slammed it toward the ocean's surface. Sarah felt her stomach drop as the altitude indicator spun downward. The Apache plummeted 300 feet in seconds before she could regain control, pulling up so hard that G-forces pressed her deep into the pilot's seat. Apache 77, we show you at 50 feet above water, came the worried voice from air traffic control. Are you maintaining control flight? Sarah keyed her radio with one hand while fighting the controls with the other. Affirmative, tower. Temporary altitude loss due to severe downdraft. Climbing back to operational height. But operational height meant different things in hurricane conditions. The higher she climbed, the stronger the winds became. At 500 feet, crosswinds tried to flip the helicopter completely over. At 200 feet, she found a pocket of slightly calmer air between the surface turbulence and the worst of the storm's fury. The oil platform appeared on radar long before she could see it visually. Platform Delta 7 was a massive structure designed to withstand hurricanes, but even it was being battered by waves that crashed over its lower levels. The helicopter landing pad sat 60 feet above the ocean, and it was currently being swept by winds that would challenge any pilot under normal circumstances. Sarah circled the platform twice, studying the wind patterns and looking for the best approach angle. The platform's emergency strobes flashed through the gray chaos, and she could see figures waving from the crew quarters. 3 people whose lives depended on her ability to land safely in conditions that should have been impossible. The platform supervisor's voice crackled through on the emergency frequency. Apache helicopter, this is platform Delta 7. We have visual contact with you. Be advised, winds here are gusting over 100 knots, and the landing pad is experiencing severe turbulence. Copy, Delta 7, Sarah replied. I'm going to attempt a precision approach from the southwest. Have your people ready for immediate loading. The approach would require everything she had learned about helicopter flight dynamics. Sarah had to account for wind shear, updrafts from the platform structure, downdrafts created by the storm, and the fact that the landing pad was moving as the entire platform swayed in the massive swells. She started her descent from a mile away, using every technique she had learned in advanced flight training. The Apache's computer systems helped compensate for wind variations, but the machine could only do so much. The rest depended on her ability to read the air and react faster than human reflexes normally allowed. At 300 yards out, a massive gust hit the helicopter from the side. The Apache tilted 45 degrees before Sarah could correct, and, for a terrifying moment, she thought the aircraft would roll completely over. The strain on the rotor system was enormous, and warning lights flickered on the instrument panel. "Come on, stay with me," she whispered to the machine, coaxing maximum performance from every system. The Apache responded like it understood the stakes, engines howling as they fought against forces of nature that seemed determined to destroy anything that challenged them. 200 yards from the platform, Sarah could see the landing pad clearly. It was a tiny target in an ocean of chaos, rising and falling with the platform's motion while being hammered by winds that made the air itself visible as sheets of rain and spray. The oil workers had prepared a stretcher for their injured colleague and were positioned near the crew quarters, ready to run for the helicopter the moment it touched down. Sarah could see the fear on their faces, but also desperate hope that their long wait for rescue was finally ending. 100 yards out, the most dangerous part of the approach began. Sarah had to slow the helicopter's forward speed while maintaining enough power to fight the winds, all while compensating for the platform's movement and the rapidly changing wind directions around the structure. The Apache's radar altimeter showed the distance to the landing pad decreasing steadily. 50 feet, 40 feet, 30 feet. At 20 feet, a sudden downdraft tried to slam the helicopter onto the platform too hard. Sarah added power and felt the engine strain against their limitations. At 10 feet above the pad, everything seemed to happen at once. The wind shifted direction, the platform rolled in a massive swell, and a gust of rain blocked her vision completely. For 5 seconds, Sarah was flying blind in a hurricane, trusting instruments and instincts while fighting to keep 2 tons of aircraft under control. When the rain cleared, the landing pad was directly below her, and the Apache was perfectly positioned for touchdown. Sarah reduced power gradually, feeling for the moment when the landing gear would contact the platform. The helicopter touched down with surprising gentleness, and she immediately engaged the rotor brake to prevent the aircraft from being blown across the deck. "We're down," she called on the radio. "Platform crew, move fast. We have maybe 60 seconds before conditions get worse." The oil workers ran through the hurricane winds toward the helicopter. The injured man was unconscious on the stretcher, carried by his 2 colleagues who struggled against wind that tried to knock them down with every step. Sarah kept the engines running at high power, ready to lift off the moment everyone was aboard. Loading the patients took 45 seconds that felt like hours. The stretcher barely fit through the helicopter's door, and the medical equipment took precious additional time to secure. Sarah watched her instruments as the storm continued to strengthen around them, knowing that every second on the platform increased the risk of being caught in conditions too severe for takeoff. "Everyone secure," shouted one of the workers as they strapped themselves into the passenger seats. "Ready for departure." Sarah lifted off immediately, feeling the Apache struggle against winds that had grown even stronger during their brief time on the platform. The return flight would be the ultimate test of machine and pilot working together against odds that everyone had said were impossible to overcome. The return flight began as a battle against physics itself. Sarah lifted the Apache off the oil platform just as Hurricane Elena's eye wall moved closer, bringing winds that screamed across the ocean at speeds that turned raindrops into bullets. The helicopter climbed heavily, weighted down with 3 passengers and fighting air currents that seemed determined to tear it apart. Apache 77, be advised that surface winds at your destination have increased to 140 miles per hour, came an urgent transmission from air traffic control. We're showing massive wind shear between your current position and the coast. Sarah checked her fuel gauges while wrestling with controls that required constant attention. The flight to the platform had consumed more fuel than planned due to the extra power needed to fight the storm. The return trip would demand even more energy, and the margins were becoming uncomfortably tight. Roger, Tower. Current fuel state allows for 45 minutes of flight time. Estimated time to base is 38 minutes under current conditions. Behind her, the injured oil worker remained unconscious while his colleagues worked to keep him stable using the helicopter's basic medical equipment. One of them was a former Navy medic who understood that time was critical for heart attack patients, especially in the middle of a hurricane 40 miles from the nearest hospital. "How's he doing back there?" Sarah called over the intercom. "Vitals are weak, but stable," replied the medic. "But he needs real medical attention soon. This storm isn't helping his condition." Sarah pushed the Apache harder, accepting higher risks to save time. She climbed to 800 feet, entering the worst of the wind shear, but finding a layer where the hurricane's rotation created slightly more predictable air currents. The helicopter shook violently as it cut through turbulence that would have grounded commercial aircraft for days. 15 miles from the coast, the storm's true power revealed itself. Wind speeds increased beyond anything Sarah had experienced, and the Apache began experiencing structural stress that triggered warning systems throughout the cockpit. The main rotor was flexing beyond normal limits, and the engines were running at emergency power settings just to maintain controlled flight. "Warning, engine temperature exceeding operational limits," announced the aircraft's computer voice. "Recommend immediate power reduction." But reducing power meant losing the battle against the hurricane winds, potentially leading to a crash that would kill everyone aboard. Sarah made the decision to continue pushing the engines beyond their design specifications, gambling that they could survive long enough to reach safety. "Apache 7-7, we're tracking you on radar," called the Base Operations Center. "Your flight path is showing extreme deviations. Do you need assistance?" Sarah almost laughed at the question. What assistance could anyone provide in the middle of a Category 4 hurricane? "Negative base. Flight path deviations due to severe turbulence. Maintaining controlled flight toward destination." The reality was more complicated. The Apache was being thrown around the sky like debris, rising and falling hundreds of feet as massive air currents grabbed the helicopter and flung it in random directions. Sarah's skill was being tested beyond anything covered in flight training, requiring her to react to conditions that changed faster than human reflexes should have been able to handle. At 10 miles from shore, disaster nearly struck. A microburst caught the helicopter and drove it toward the ocean's surface with tremendous force. The radar altimeter showed altitude dropping at over 3,000 feet per minute, and the water rushed up toward them at terrifying speed. Sarah pulled maximum power from both engines, feeling them strain against loads that threatened to tear them apart. The Apache's nose pitched up sharply as she fought the downdraft, and for 20 seconds, the outcome remained uncertain. Either the engines would provide enough power to escape the microburst, or everyone aboard would die in the next few moments. The helicopter leveled off at 150 feet above the waves, engines screaming at power settings that should have destroyed them. Sarah had pushed the Apache beyond its documented performance limits, and somehow the machine had responded, proving that engineering margins existed for exactly these impossible situations. "Holy hell," breathed one of the oil workers over the intercom. "I felt my soul leave my body for a minute there." But the crisis had cost them precious fuel, and the engine temperature gauges showed readings that glowed red on the instrument panel. The Apache was giving everything it had, but the laws of thermodynamics couldn't be ignored indefinitely. Something would have to give soon. 5 miles from the coast, Sarah made visual contact with the airbase through breaks in the storm clouds. The runway lights appeared and disappeared in the driving rain, but they represented safety for the people depending on her skills. The base fire department had emergency vehicles standing by, and medical personnel waited with ambulances for the heart attack victim. "Apache 7-7, you are cleared for immediate approach to any available landing area," transmitted the tower controller. "Emergency services are standing by. Winds at the field are gusting to 120 miles per hour. The final approach would require precision that seemed impossible under the circumstances. Sarah had to descend through the worst turbulence while managing engines that were running dangerously hot and a helicopter that was being pushed to its absolute limits. She began the approach 2 miles out, using every technique she had learned about flying in extreme weather. The Apache descended through layers of wind shear that tried to flip it upside down, while Sarah fought to maintain enough control to reach the runway safely. At 1 mile out, both engines began showing signs of imminent failure. Temperature readings climbed into ranges that meant catastrophic damage was likely within minutes. Sarah had to choose between attempting a powered landing with failing engines or trying to auto-rotate the helicopter to a crash landing that might save lives, but would certainly destroy the aircraft. The decision came down to trust in the machine that had already exceeded every expectation. Sarah committed to a powered approach, betting everything on engines that were destroying themselves to keep everyone alive. The Apache responded with its final reserves of power, carrying its human cargo toward a landing that would either end in triumph or tragedy. The airbase appeared through sheets of hurricane rain like a mirage in the storm. Sarah could see emergency vehicles lined up along the runway, their lights flashing through the gray chaos as ground crews waited for an outcome that nobody could predict. The Apache's engines were screaming at temperatures that should have caused immediate shutdown, but somehow they continued providing power for the final approach. Engine number 2, showing critical temperature readings, called the aircraft's warning system. Immediate landing required. Sarah keyed her radio with hands that never stopped working the controls. Tower, Apache 77 on final approach. Be advised I have engine emergencies and may need crash rescue immediately upon landing. Roger, 77. All emergency services are standing by. You're cleared to land anywhere you can put her down safely. The runway stretched out below them, a ribbon of concrete that represented salvation if she could reach it before the engines failed completely. But landing in hurricane winds required more than just reaching the ground. She had to touch down softly enough to avoid damage while fighting crosswinds that could flip the helicopter at the last second. Half a mile from touchdown, engine number 2 began losing power. The temperature gauge showed readings beyond the red line, and Sarah could hear the difference in the engine sound as internal components started failing. The Apache began yawing to one side as power became unbalanced between the two engines. "Come on, baby, just a little bit more," Sarah whispered to the machine, adjusting controls to compensate for the failing engine. The helicopter's computer systems worked frantically to maintain stability, but even advanced technology had limits when hardware was destroying itself. At a quarter-mile out, she could see people on the ground watching her approach. Colonel Richardson stood near the fire trucks, probably second-guessing his decision to authorize this mission. The medical team waited with stretchers and equipment ready to save the heart attack victim if the helicopter could just make it those final few hundred yards. Engine number 2 died completely as Sarah crossed the runway threshold. The Apache lurched sideways as half its power disappeared, and she had to use every bit of her skill to prevent the helicopter from rolling over. Engine number 1 screamed at maximum power, trying to carry the full load alone while fighting winds that seemed determined to destroy anything that challenged them. Engine failure, announced the warning system unnecessarily. Sarah was already executing emergency procedures learned in simulator training, but no simulator had ever replicated the combination of engine failure and hurricane force winds. The helicopter descended toward the runway in a barely controlled fall. Sarah managed the auto-rotation while trying to maintain enough power from the remaining engine to cushion the landing. The Apache touched down hard but upright, bouncing once before settling onto the concrete, as Sarah immediately shut down the surviving engine. Emergency vehicles raced toward them as the rotor blades spun down. Fire trucks surrounded the helicopter while medical personnel ran through hurricane winds to reach the passenger compartment. The heart attack victim was transferred to an ambulance within minutes, unconscious, but alive thanks to a flight that everyone had said was impossible. Sarah remained in the pilot's seat for several moments after shutdown, hands still gripping controls that no longer responded to her commands. The adrenaline that had carried her through the mission was wearing off, replaced by the realization of how close they had come to disaster. Colonel Richardson appeared at her door, shouting over the hurricane winds. "Martinez, are you injured? How did you manage to bring her home?" Sarah unbuckled her harness and climbed down from the cockpit on legs that felt unsteady after 2 hours of fighting the storm. "The Apache did most of the work, sir. I just tried not to interfere with what the machine wanted to do." The aircraft maintenance team was already examining the engines, finding damage that would require complete rebuilds. Chief Thompson shook his head as he looked at temperature readings that should have been impossible to survive. "I've never seen engines run this hot without complete failure," he told Sarah. "Whatever you did up there, you got performance from this bird that goes beyond anything in the technical manuals." The rescued oil workers approached Sarah as medical teams checked them for injuries. The former Navy medic extended his hand with obvious gratitude. "Ma'am, I've been in some hairy situations, but what you just did was beyond anything I've ever seen. You saved our friend's life by flying through conditions that should have killed all of us." Within hours, news of the rescue began spreading throughout the military aviation community. Pilots who had decades of experience were studying the mission details, trying to understand how someone had successfully flown an Apache helicopter through a Category 4 hurricane. Major Stevens, who had earlier expressed doubts about the mission, found Sarah in the operations center where she was completing her after-action reports. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I've been flying for 20 years, and I would never have attempted what you pulled off today." But Sarah understood that the mission's success had depended on more than just her skills as a pilot. The Apache helicopter had performed beyond its design specifications. Engines had run far past their normal limits, and weather conditions had provided just enough windows of opportunity to make the impossible barely possible. The heart attack victim survived his medical emergency and was transferred to a major hospital where specialists were able to stabilize his condition. His family sent a letter thanking Sarah for risking her life to save someone she had never met, a gesture that meant more to her than any military decoration. Colonel Richardson called her into his office the next morning as Hurricane Elena finally moved inland and began weakening. "Martinez, I've been in the military for 30 years, and I've never seen anything like what you accomplished yesterday. The Pentagon wants a full report on how you managed to operate an Apache in those conditions." Sarah had spent the night writing detailed accounts of every decision and technique she had used during the mission. But she knew that much of what had happened couldn't be reduced to procedures and checklists. Some aspects of flying required intuition, experience, and a willingness to push beyond documented limitations when lives were at stake. 3 months after Hurricane Elena, Sarah Martinez found herself standing in front of a room full of military aviation experts at the Pentagon. Her rescue mission had become a case study that was changing how the military thought about helicopter operations in extreme weather conditions. The presentation screen behind her displayed technical data from the Apache's flight recorders, showing performance curves that aerospace engineers had previously thought impossible. "Captain Martinez," said General Harrison, the Air Force's top helicopter program director, "your mission has forced us to reconsider the operational limits of rotary wing aircraft. The flight data shows engine performance that exceeded manufacturer specifications by 30%. How did you know the aircraft could handle those conditions?" Sarah stood at attention, remembering the doubt in everyone's eyes just a few months earlier. "Sir, I studied the engineering margins built into the Apache's design. The published limitations are conservative figures intended for routine operations. In emergency situations, the aircraft can exceed those limits for short periods." The room contained pilots, engineers, and military officials who were responsible for aviation safety policies that affected thousands of aircrew members. Sarah's successful rescue had proven that current weather restrictions might be too conservative, potentially preventing future rescue missions that could save lives. Colonel Richardson, who had been promoted partly based on his decision to authorize Sarah's mission, presented the detailed analysis his team had compiled. The mission data shows that modern helicopters have capabilities beyond what we currently utilize. Captain Martinez demonstrated techniques that could be incorporated into advanced training programs. Dr. Elizabeth Chun, a civilian aerospace engineer from the Apache's manufacturer, raised her hand. The engine telemetry data is particularly interesting. Both power plants operated at temperatures that should have caused immediate failure, yet they continued functioning long enough to complete the mission. This suggests our understanding of engine stress limits may be incomplete. Sarah had worked with Dr. Chen's team to analyze exactly what had happened to the Apache's engines during the Hurricane flight. The investigation revealed that modern turbine engines had safety margins larger than anyone had realized, allowing them to survive extreme conditions for limited periods when operated by skilled pilots who understood their limitations. The key factor was power management, Sarah explained to the room. I never held maximum power for more than 60 seconds at a time, allowing the engines to cool slightly between peak demand periods. This prevented catastrophic failure while still providing enough performance to complete the mission. The rescue mission had also changed Sarah's career trajectory in ways she hadn't expected. She was selected for the military's most advanced helicopter test pilot program, where she would evaluate new aircraft and push them to their operational limits under controlled conditions. The skills she had demonstrated during Hurricane Elena made her uniquely qualified for testing that required both technical precision and willingness to operate beyond normal boundaries. Lieutenant Commander Walsh, the Navy pilot who had supported her mission planning during the hurricane, was now working with Sarah to develop new training protocols. We're creating simulation programs that will teach pilots how to recognize when extreme weather operations are possible versus when they're suicidal, he explained to the Pentagon audience. The heart attack victim Sarah had rescued, James Morrison, had made a complete recovery and returned to work on offshore oil platforms. He attended the Pentagon briefing via video conference, his presence serving as a reminder of why pilots sometimes needed to attempt missions that seemed impossible. Captain Martinez didn't just save my life, Morrison said from his home in Louisiana. She proved that highly trained people with the right equipment can accomplish things that everyone else says can't be done. That kind of courage and skill makes all the difference when lives are on the line. The briefing concluded with announcements of policy changes that would affect military aviation for years to come. Weather restrictions would be modified to allow experienced pilots more discretion in emergency situations. Training programs would include advanced modules on extreme weather flying techniques. And the Apache helicopter's official performance specifications would be updated to reflect capabilities that had been proven during Sarah's rescue mission. After the meeting, General Harrison approached Sarah privately. Captain, I have an offer that might interest you. NASA is looking for test pilots with your particular combination of skills and experience. They're developing new aircraft for Mars exploration missions, and they need pilots who know how to operate machines at the edge of their performance envelopes. Sarah considered the opportunity while thinking about the path that had brought her to this moment. Growing up in Tornado Alley, learning from her father that calculated risks were different from reckless risks, studying engineering data that most pilots ignored, and trusting her skills when everyone else said the mission was impossible. Sir, I'd be honored to contribute to that program, she replied. But I'd also like to continue working on the helicopter training protocols we discussed today. There are probably other pilots out there who could accomplish similar missions if they had the right preparation. 6 months later, Sarah was dividing her time between NASA's experimental aircraft program and the military's Advanced Helicopter Training Center. The techniques she had developed during Hurricane Elena were now being taught to elite pilots from all branches of the armed services, ensuring that future rescue missions would have better chances of success. The Apache helicopter she had flown through the hurricane was rebuilt and returned to service, its engines completely overhauled, but its airframe still showing the stress marks from that impossible flight. Chief Thompson had insisted on keeping the aircraft in active service rather than retiring it to a museum, arguing that machines which had proven themselves under extreme conditions deserved to continue serving. Sarah's story spread throughout the aviation community, inspiring young pilots who face their own moments of doubt and encouraging experienced aviators to reconsider what they thought was possible. She received letters from helicopter pilots around the world who were incorporating her techniques into their own training and emergency procedures. But the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. James Morrison's 8-year-old daughter sent Sarah a hand-drawn picture of a helicopter flying through a storm, with the words, "Thank you for bringing Daddy home," written in careful crayon letters. Sarah kept that drawing on her desk as a reminder that technical skills and advanced training meant nothing without the willingness to use them when someone's life depended on pushing beyond what everyone else thought was possible. Sometimes being doubted by all was just another challenge to overcome, like hurricane winds or failing engines or the laws of physics themselves.